Under the glowing chandeliers of a luxury resort in Scottsdale, Arizona, Prince Harry stood before a room of billionaires, flashing a familiar aristocratic smile. It was an exclusive fundraising gala for African Parks, an organization embarking on a highly ambitious campaign to secure $1 billion in funding. In that fleeting moment, surrounded by high society wealth, everything looked perfectly normal. It looked like the traditional work of a modern progressive royal, but what looked like a routine public appearance was actually a devastating metaphor for a catastrophic moral collapse. Thousands of miles away, deep in the rainforests of the Republic of Congo, the indigenous Baka people were living in absolute terror. They were allegedly being beaten, tortured, and brutally violated by the very armed rangers funded by the organization Harry was fronting. This is the story of an ethical bankruptcy that money cannot fix and public relations cannot hide. Over the next few minutes, you are going to understand exactly how a man who built an entire post-royal brand on the weaponization of victimhood and the crusade against systemic bias found himself sitting on the board of a charity accused of horrific human rights abuses. We are going to unpack the dark psychological truth behind his refusal to step down, the quiet evaporation of his commercial empire, and the subtle social media signals that reveal a staggering level of isolation. This is not just a story about a mismanaged charity. This is the anatomy of a prince who has nothing left to sell, desperately clinging to a burning house because he has nowhere else to go. To truly comprehend the magnitude of this fall from grace, we must first look backward. We have to rebuild the man before the collapse to understand why the public once cared so deeply for him. There was a time not that long ago when Prince Harry was the undisputed favorite of the British monarchy. He was the lovable rogue, the frontline soldier, the boy who broke the world's heart as he walked behind his mother's coffin. But more than that, Harry had a genuine, palpable connection to Africa. It was his sanctuary. When the pressures of palace life became suffocating, Africa was where he went to breathe. Viewers and royal watchers remember the images of a young, sunburnt prince in Lesotho, sitting in the red dirt, holding orphans who had lost their parents to HIV. He was entirely at ease, devoid of pretense, showing a gentle kindness that felt incredibly authentic. He once stated that his ultimate dream was to move to Africa, live among the wildlife, and work in conservation. That was the golden era. That was the Harry the public invested in emotionally. The contrast between that empathetic young man and the hollow, corporate figure we see today is the ultimate tragedy of this story. It makes the current reality of his staggering exploitation not just disappointing, but intensely uncomfortable to watch. But before the African Park scandal truly erupted, the foundation of the Sussex Empire was already quietly fracturing. When Harry and his wife Meghan walked away from the royal family, they did so with the promise of building a billion-dollar philanthropic and commercial powerhouse in Hollywood. They were going to do things differently. They were going to speak truth to power. Yet as the years dragged on, the illusion of their immense global power collided violently with their commercial desperation. The Spotify deal collapsed, with executives publicly questioning their work ethic. The Netflix partnership stalled with projects quietly scrapped, including a heavily promoted behind-the-scenes documentary about the elite world of polo. The lucrative speaking circuit, which initially saw Harry commanding up to $1 million per engagement, began to dry up completely. Industry insiders noted that his fees plummeted toward the $50,000 mark, and even then, the phone simply stopped ringing. The corporate world had realized a brutal truth. Harry had one story to tell, a story of family grievance, and once that story was sold in his memoir, the well of content was entirely dry. This financial reality is the critical pressure point that explains everything that followed. As the Hollywood deals evaporated, the only currency Harry had left to legitimize his royal status was his charitable portfolio. But even that began to rot from the inside out. The Invictus Games, once his crowning achievement and a profoundly moving tribute to wounded veterans, began to mutate into a public relations dumpster fire. The games were originally designed to spotlight military heroes who had lost limbs, suffered severe trauma, and fought their way back from the brink of despair. Instead, they increasingly became a highly orchestrated backdrop for Meghan's designer wardrobe and Harry's political posturing. Veterans and their families began to express deep frustration that the spotlight had been stolen. Key sponsors allegedly, including major corporate backers like Boeing, began to quietly run for the hills. Simultaneously, his grip on Centerbal, the charity he co-founded in his mother's memory, appeared to weaken following reported clashes with its new leadership. Everything he touched seemed to inherit a reverse Midas touch. And then came the unthinkable. The crisis that should have ended his association with African parks overnight. Early in 2024, horrifying accusations emerged regarding the Odzala National Park managed by African Parks. Survival International, a fiercely dedicated indigenous rights organization, blew the whistle on what they described as a reign of terror. Members of the Baka community, an indigenous hunter-gatherer tribe with deep ancestral ties to the Congo Basin, reported unspeakable violence at the hands of the park's eco-guards. The allegations were not about minor policy infractions. They were about systemic torture, severe beatings, and unimaginable abuse. Survival International publicly condemned the organization's fortress conservation model, labeling it as a form of neocolonialism. The irony was staggering. Here was Prince Harry, the man who had sat on American television and implicitly accused his own family of unconscious bias, now serving as the public face of an organization accused of funding armed men who were actively terrorizing a vulnerable black indigenous population. The moral contradiction was absolute. When the allegations surfaced, African Parks commissioned an independent investigation led by Omnia Strategy, a London law firm run by Cherie Blair. By May, the review concluded with a devastating admission: human rights abuses had indeed occurred. The organization issued a highly sanitized corporate statement expressing deep regret for the pain and suffering caused to the victims, promising sweeping reforms and better oversight. For any high-profile celebrity, this would be the definitive point of no return. If George Clooney, Oprah Winfrey, or Elton John found themselves on the board of a charity facing verified claims of torture against an indigenous tribe, their resignation would be drafted before the news cycle even peaked. The risk of reputational annihilation would simply be too high. But Harry did not resign. He chose to stay. When journalists pushed his representatives for a comment on why the Duke of Sussex refused to step down, they were met with a wall of silence, merely redirected back to the charity's sterile press release. He offered no personal apology, no righteous anger, no demand for immediate justice. The man who had spent years demanding public accountability from the British press and his own father was suddenly completely devoid of a voice. This is where the story shifts from a public relations disaster to a dark psychological reality. Why does he endure this visual humiliation? Why allow his name to be dragged through the mud of such a wicked controversy? Because to step down from African Parks is to admit that yet another pillar of his post-royal identity has crumbled. If he loses this, he is no longer the global humanitarian. He is just an exiled prince sitting in a California mansion, surrounded by cancelled contracts and the echoes of his past. But as the pressure mounts and indigenous leaders beg him to sever ties, the silence from the Sussex camp has become deafening. The Baka people remain in fear, their ancestral lands militarized, while Harry attempts to hold on to the very last shreds of his relevance. And just as Survival International prepared to escalate their campaign against the prince, a chilling signal emerged from back home in London, a quiet, devastating move from King Charles that proved once and for all that the doors to the palace were permanently locked. The chilling signal from London was as quiet as it was absolute. For years, Harry had operated under the lingering delusion that, no matter how much damage he inflicted upon his family, a path of return would always remain open. He believed that his royal birthright offered him a permanent safety net, a revolving door back into the inner sanctum of the British monarchy should his Californian gamble fail. But as the African Parks scandal deepened and his commercial viability plummeted, the palace delivered a masterclass in weaponized restraint. King Charles did not issue a fiery public condemnation. He simply closed the door and turned the lock. The eviction from Frogmore Cottage was the physical manifestation of this permanent severance. The home gifted by the late Queen and lavishly renovated by the Sussexes with millions of dollars was quietly reclaimed. But the truly devastating detail, the detail that exposed the sheer toxicity of the Sussex brand, was what happened next. The property was reportedly offered to Prince Andrew, a man engulfed in his own catastrophic disgrace. And yet, even Andrew allegedly refused the move, seemingly unwilling to be associated with the lingering specter of Harry and Meghan. It was a brutal, silent humiliation. The palace was meticulously erasing their footprint from British soil, leaving Harry geographically and institutionally stranded. This total estrangement from his family forms the psychological backdrop for his current desperation. Cut off from the palace machinery that once protected his image and covered his blunders, Harry is now entirely reliant on a Hollywood public relations apparatus that he does not seem to fully understand or control. To observe him in public now is to witness a profound physical transformation. Gone is the relaxed, charismatic soldier who could effortlessly command a room. In his place is a man who appears perpetually tense. His public appearances heavily curated and aggressively steered by his wife. Behavioral analysts and royal observers have frequently pointed out the subtle yet devastating physical dynamics between the couple during public outings. The constant hand-holding that feels less like affection and more like restraint, the subtle taps on his back to signal when a conversation must end, the gentle but firm physical pulls guiding him away from unscripted moments. What was once marketed as an epic modern romance increasingly looks to the public like a suffocating hostage situation. He traded the rigid protocols of the British monarchy for a different kind of captivity, one where his every movement is heavily managed to serve a commercial narrative that is rapidly running out of oxygen. This isolation has led to a series of staggering errors in judgment. In a desperate bid to remain relevant, Harry has attempted to reinvent himself as a global thought leader. Stepping far outside the boundaries of his intellect and experience, he began dipping his toes into deeply complex geopolitical issues, completely oblivious to the weight of his words. When he penned a controversial article for the New Statesman, he attempted to offer profound commentary on global conflict, but ended up heavily criticized for effectively victim-blaming marginalized groups and minimizing the harsh realities of anti-Semitism. He alienated the exact progressive intellectual base he was so desperately trying to court. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. It proved that, without the careful guidance of royal advisors, his attempts at diplomacy are not just clumsy, they are actively destructive to his own reputation. And that brings us back to the suffocating jungles of the Congo and the terrified Baka people who are still waiting for the Duke of Sussex to do the right thing. The African Parks scandal is not fading away. It is the inescapable anchor pulling his moral credibility into the abyss. Survival International has made it clear they will not stop applying pressure. Indigenous leaders, risking their own safety to speak out, have explicitly stated that the organization Harry represents wants to make their tribe disappear. Think about the sheer gravity of that accusation. The man who sat before a global audience and demanded compassion, who built an entire post-royal identity on the concept of healing and speaking truth to power, is effectively providing a celebrity shield for an organization accused of funding violence and neo-colonial erasure. His refusal to step down from the board is the ultimate exposure of his moral contradiction. He cannot walk away because he is paralyzed by the terrifying realization that if he gives up this final shred of institutional prestige, he has absolutely nothing left. No royal duties, no Spotify podcasts, no political influence, and no moral high ground. This story resonates so deeply with the public because it is a modern tragedy of hubris. We are watching the real-time collapse of a man who was handed everything: immense privilege, universal adoration, a platform to change the world, and threw it all away in a bonfire of grievance and commercial greed. The public schadenfreude is not born out of cruelty, but out of a collective exhaustion. The world is tired of being lectured on ethics by a prince who refuses to hold himself to the very standards he demands of everyone else. Looking forward, there is no grand redemption arc on the horizon. The bridges to London are burned to ash. The Hollywood elite, notoriously ruthless when the star power fades, have already begun to distance themselves. Prince Harry is now trapped in a gilded cage in Montecito, a king of a non-existent castle, furiously clinging to a charity board seat while the most vulnerable people on earth pay the price for his desperate need to remain important. The tragedy is not just that he fell from grace. The tragedy is that when the moment came to actually stand up for the marginalized and do the right thing, he simply looked the other way. Thank you for joining us as we unpack this complex and devastating story. If you appreciate this deep dive into the realities hiding behind the headlines, please subscribe to the channel, leave your thoughts in the comments below, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. We will see you in the next video.